Good evening, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Navigating the Green Transition Dilemma, Minerals, Uranium and Energy Security in Divided West. My name is Tea Törmänen and I am the Head of Global Development for We Planet, and I'm thrilled to see all of you here. Why did we decide to organize this webinar? We all know that we need an energy transition. We need to phase out fossil fuels and substitute them with cleaner, low-emission alternatives. But this transition cannot happen without critical resources such as the lithium, cobalt and rare earths that we need for batteries and wind turbines and solar panels, and the uranium that fuels our nuclear reactors. However, the very resources we need to save the planet are trapped in a web of environmental concerns, social resistance and geopolitical tensions. So today we ask, how do we balance social and environmental sustainability with climate emergency? And how can the West lead the green transition while navigating a divided world? We will also discuss the EU's new Critical Raw Materials Act, which is putting pressure on the member states to increase mining activities. For those of you who are new to We Planet, let me share a bit about who we are. We Planet is a global community of changemakers, scientists, engineers and activists, and we are all united by a single mission to accelerate the transition to sustainable, equitable and resilient world where both humans and nature can live in abundance. We don't just talk about challenges, we propose solutions. And today's event is a perfect example of our approach. We're not here to offer easy answers because the topic is very complicated. We're here to confront the hard questions and to come up with actionable solutions. So what can you expect this evening? Over the next 2 hours, we will hear from the leading voices who are on the front lines of this dilemma. First, we will have 3 presentations from our amazing speakers, and after that, all 3 will join me in a panel discussion where we continue talking about these topics. We will end with the webinar with a Q&A session, so please use the chat for questions you may have for the panelists, and then we'll pick some of the questions that the panelists can then answer. Our first speaker today is Lucy Crane. Lucy Crane is a geologist and an ECG consultant with a hands-on experience in building Europe's critical mineral supply chains. Previously at Cornish Lithium, she helped spearhead exploration from lithium in the UK before moving on to lead the company's ESG function, guiding planning, permitting and stakeholder engagement while securing major public and private investment. She now works with companies, investors and governments to embed responsible practices into the development of critical mineral projects that will power the energy transition. Please, Lucy, go ahead.
Thank you very much, and thank you so much for the invitation to take part in this evening's session. I'm just going to share my screen, so bear with me for 2 seconds, everybody, please. It's just taking a moment to pop up. So, as Tia said, my background is exploration geology, but kind of as my career's progressed, I've realised that people really are at the heart of everything that we're trying to do in the mining industry, and we need to make sure that we're bringing everybody along on this journey with us in an equitable and fair way. Hopefully you can see this now. So yes, for the next 20 minutes or so, I'm just going to talk a little bit about what is the context in Europe and perhaps what some of the opportunities and challenges might be. So, as I said, I started out my career as an exploration geologist, very enthusiastic to find shiny rocks, working in various parts of Africa initially, and then back in the UK, I spent 8 years with a company looking to extract lithium from both geothermal waters, but also from hard rock itself, from the granite. I left there last year, and my role had transitioned very much into the ESG space. And I feel very lucky that that's happened, because I really do believe it's the people and the context that are key. The rocks are, of course, incredibly important, but all of the other bits of the jigsaw piece, the funding, the policies that are in place at a government level, the community engagement and sentiment and social license to operate, those are all of the other parts of the jigsaw puzzle that we need to have to be able to unlock the potential that we have. So I'm currently a consultant. I work with a group called Satala. So we're a risk and ESG consultancy. And then with another hat on, I'm also the managing director of Women in Mining over here in the UK, which is a voluntary role, but we're an organisation looking at kind of collaboration and leadership and how can we make the mining industry a more inclusive place for everybody. So I wanted to start with this slide, and this is a picture of the Nebra sky disk, which is a beautiful artefact, and it's, I think, 3,600 years old. It was found in Germany in 1999, and it's a really interesting story if you have time to give it a Google, because it seems like it was found by somebody who was doing metal detecting in a place where they shouldn't have been, and they didn't have permission. So although it was heard about and rumours started to appear that this amazing artefact had been found, it didn't actually come into public ownership until a few years later. But anyway, why I wanted to show it to you today is that it's 3,600 years old, and a few years ago there was a project to do fingerprinting to see where those metals have come from. So you can look at the isotopic fingerprint of the metals and you can trace it back to where it has been extracted from. And what it shows is that the gold and the tin that are within it are from Cornwall, so the southwest of the UK where I'm based. The copper in it is from Saxony, and I think there was also evidence of metals from other parts of Europe. And I find that fascinating because it shows that 3,500 years ago there was quite sophisticated metal trading happening across Europe already at that time. And if we look at how technology has evolved over time, we're actually using more and more of the periodic table as time goes on. We find more niche applications for things. But what this means in reality is that, there's certain things that we understand quite well. So carbon, copper, gold, these are things that we've been exploring for a long time. We have pretty robust ways of processing them. But if we look at some of the parts of the periodic table that we're now using for the energy transition, for example, a lot of the rare earth elements, lithium is a key thing, cobalt, we might have extracted them in fairly small quantities previously, but actually we need them in much larger quantities now, and we need them from a whole host of different sources as well. So as well as looking for mineral deposits that are in more remote locations or deeper underground, actually it seems that there's an increasing argument to also look what's on our doorstep here in Europe. For a long time, I think it's fair to say we've exported a lot of the impacts of the raw materials that we use in this part of the world, and actually we do have mineral deposits on our doorsteps. I don't think we'll ever be fully self-sufficient, and we will always have to rely on trading with other countries, and arguably having reasons to be nice to each other is probably no bad thing. But I think there is that shift that we've seen over the last few years of Europe starting to think, what do we have on our doorstep? Is there a way that we could actually extract that, and could we do it in a way that's responsible? So this concept of the fourth industrial revolution, based around a transition away from a carbon-based economy, so burning fossil fuels, burning coal and oil and gas, to one that's powered by renewable energy, is also driving a huge shift in the metals that we need, the raw materials that we actually need to be able to do this. There's a statistic that society as a whole has mined about 550 million tonnes of copper, I believe, over the last few thousand years. We need that same amount of copper again over the next 20 years, just to kind of put into scale that electrification and growing populations around the world are really putting that pressure on natural resources. So there's a whole conversation around, well, what's already in circulation? How can we recycle it? How can we design things for second life applications and keep these metals once we've actually gone to the effort of finding them, digging them up, processing them and putting them into a product? How can we keep them in circulation for as long as possible? But it still, in our lifetimes, is not, in my opinion, going to negate the need for us to actually extract primary raw materials too. So there's huge drivers for this increasing in demand in minerals that we're seeing. Not all driven by the US. We've got growing populations. The energy transition means we need more and more of that periodic table. But minerals are in the news so much more now than they were 5 years ago, let alone 2 years ago. And a huge amount of that is because of the changing and ever-changing, rapidly changing geopolitics that we see. So these are just some of the headlines from the last few months that I pulled out. So the US has obviously had some conversations with Ukraine about its minerals and how it would like access to those minerals on condition of, supporting them in their conflict. China holds the reins of a lot of these raw materials, and actually, that is something that they can use to apply geopolitical pressure if and when they need to. There was also the mad thing in the news of Trump saying that he wants Greenland, and a huge amount of the reason for that is not only from a strategic defence perspective, but it's also because of their potential for rare earths. So what is critical changes over time and changes with your perspective as well. So some of these minerals that are considered critical is because they're so important to our society and our economy, or they might be really scarce and hard to get hold of, or we just rely on one country as a source. So what is critical really changes with the context that you're in. So for example, this is from the UK's critical minerals strategy, and this is how the UK government has started to assess criticality. So you can see along the x-axis at the bottom, we look at how vulnerable is the UK economy to the supply of this mineral. And then on the y-axis, we're looking at the global supply risk. So as you move into that top right corner, basically becomes more and more critical. And criticality really depends on the lens that you're looking at it. So geography is key, time is key, and geopolitics is key as well. And I really like this. So if you haven't come across the website Visual Capitalist, I've linked to it in the bottom here. I highly recommend going and having a look because they have some amazing infographics, and they do quite a lot actually around the mining industry and raw materials. And I liked this one because it shows the number of countries that have actually adopted a mineral strategy over the last 15 years or so. And you can see that actually between 2010 and 2018, Russia had one, France had one, a few other places, but actually it's really in the last few years that we've seen this dramatic uptick in the number of countries that actually have a mineral strategy. And that's very true here in the UK. It was 2022 when the UK government first published its critical minerals strategy, and they updated it last year. And before that, so when I was in the early days of Cornish Lithium, I remember us having a conversation with one of the ministers in government, and they were talking about the energy transition and how it's really critical that we, start to build more renewable energies. And we had a conversation, well, where are you going to source the raw materials from that you need for this energy transition? And the government person was like, what do you mean, where are we going to get it from? We're like, well, where are you going to get the raw materials from that you need for the energy transition? And they just kind of looked at us blankly and said, we just buy them. And you're like, yes, but where from? And you can see the cogs turning. They're like, oh, we hadn't thought about that. Like, where's it come from and what's the impact of it? It's pretty key. So different countries have their own critical minerals list. And coming back to the fact that context is key, what's critical for one country isn't necessarily critical for another geography. And actually there's, at the moment, no universally accepted definition of what makes a mineral critical. And these lists are changing constantly because the geopolitical and supply context is changing. So here, back in 2014, we had 14 raw materials on the EU's critical minerals list. By a couple of years ago, that had more than doubled, and we were at 34 raw materials. And this is because it's becoming sharply into focus that the mineral demand that these changing economies need is really significant, and that's not something we've really seen in our lifetime before. So you can just see here there is an overlap between what China, the EU and the US designate as critical as of 2023, but we don't fully align on everything. So I'm sure this is familiar to many of you, but the EU brought into play the Critical Raw Materials Act back in 2024. So this is part of the European Green Deal, and very much with the objective of how can we take more control of the raw materials that we need in Europe, because we recognise that some of these raw materials are really crucial to our economies and to our society, and at the moment perhaps we're overly reliant on importing all of them. So there's two different categories within the Critical Raw Materials Act. One is critical raw materials, which have been designated as highly important for the EU's economy, but they also have a high risk of supply disruption. And then ones that didn't quite make the cut but are still really important are strategic raw materials. So these are the ones that, it's a subset of the critical raw materials. And they've been designated as strategic because they're used in things such as defence or digital or space. In the box on the side, you can see some of the estimates for how much demand is projected to increase. So this was written in 2024. The estimate was that we would need 6 times the amount of rare earths by 2030 than we were using back in 2024, and that's going to increase to 7 times by 2050. In lithium, we see a huge ramp up, and that's because lithium is the lightest weight metal. It's got a really high charge density, so it's great for you to use it in batteries, if you want a battery to be lightweight and portable, for example. So, that could be up to 20 times the current use by 2050, which is rapidly approaching. And so there's a number of kind of key pillars within the Critical Raw Materials Act, and some benchmarks of what we're aiming to do in Europe over the next few years. So by 2030, we're aiming for at least 10% of what we're consuming annually to come from mines that are based within Europe. We're equally looking to source at least 40% of that material to process it in Europe. We want to be recycling at least 15% of that total that we're consuming annually, and also aiming that we're not going to rely on a single source outside of Europe for more than 65% of each strategic raw material for supply. So these are all great ambitions, but at the moment I believe those targets aren't legally enforceable for member states. So how we actually do this in practice is still up for debate. And equally, there haven't been a huge number of financial incentives, perhaps, to attract some of these new projects and support these goals. A really important part of the Critical Raw Materials Act was the ability to identify strategic projects for the EU. And the idea is that these strategic projects are going to have streamlined planning and permitting. So on average, once you've found a mineral deposit anywhere in the world now, and finding a mineral deposit can take years. Once you've found that deposit and are confident enough that there is a certain amount of that metal or raw material in the ground, it then takes on average 17 years to bring that into production. And that's because you've got to raise money for the project, and it costs a lot of money to build a mine, but also because you need to get permits and you need to get planning permission, and you need to, really importantly, bring the local community along with you. You need to make sure that it's going to be acceptable in their minds, and you want to have this, social license to operate. So what these strategic projects are looking to do is Europe has identified a number of these projects, and the concept is, well, these are going to be really important to us. These are going to help us meet those targets that we saw on the last slide. So how can we streamline their planning and permitting? And also, we've highlighted these as strategic projects. So hopefully that will then be a catalyst for getting funding more easily to actually bring these projects into production. So ideally, these projects that you can see here, so they're a mixture of mining projects, recycling projects across a whole load of different commodities. In theory, if these all come on stream in time, it will mean that the EU can fully meet its extraction, processing and recycling benchmarks for lithium and cobalt by 2030, and actually would also move the needle quite significantly for graphite, nickel and manganese. So, it was quite a process. A lot of projects applied to become a strategic project, but there were these 47 that were selected. And then at the end of last year, the Resource EU Action Plan was also announced. And this is kind of bringing that piece of the puzzle about funding. So not only is it looking to fast track some of these strategic projects through the permitting, but equally it's trying to unlock another 3 billion, or mobilise is the wording that they're using, mobilise up to 3 billion euros in funding for these projects, which again is pretty key. So what does this mean globally? What does the global industry look like, and where does Europe sit within that? So amazingly, the first ever kind of comprehensive data set of where mines and mining processing facilities are located in the world was actually only released at the end of last year. So the ICMM, which is the International Council for Mining and Metals, they released this global mining data set last year. And here you can see that the darker colours are the number of facilities. So they've identified nearly 13,000 mines and 2,000 sites for processing raw materials and metals. And it basically shows us that there are 75% of national economies that either have large-scale mining or processing in country. But you can see that the hotspots really are China, the USA and Australia. That's where we see the largest density of these projects. From a kind of exploration perspective, or where do the mineral deposits occur, this graph shows you again, and it's quite complicated to read, but basically it's showing the places, the countries in the world that have over 5% of global mining production for certain commodities. So again, you can see China is very dark red, produces 21% of the world's aluminium, 52% of the world's antimony at the moment. Russia's producing 10% of the world's gold, 11% of the magnesite, etc., etc. And from a European perspective, this is where Europe is sourcing the minerals that are currently on its critical and strategic lists. So you can see again, China just really dominates. It's not just China though. The hotspots are cobalt from the DRC and tantalum, beryllium, hafnium and things like that from Canada and the USA, niobium from down in South America, as well as lots of lithium and copper from, Chile and Peru and other places. So there is quite a lot of geographic concentration as to where these mineral deposits are found. But if we look at where they're processed and refined into usable products, red is China. And you can see that China dominates in quite a few of the raw materials that are on those energy strategic minerals, but actually who's processing them and adding that value is China. They've been incredibly smart. I'm aware I've just got a few minutes left, so hopefully that aligns with what everybody else is timing. But I know this diagram is a few years old now, but I just wanted to show it because there's so much conversation around critical minerals and energy transition minerals and strategic minerals. But although this is a few years out of date, I think proportionally it's still relatively accurate. And I think it's just always good to kind of zoom out sometimes. We have so much conversation about these critical minerals and these strategic minerals. Actually, in the grand scheme of things, it's such a small subset of everything that we're mining around the world. Iron ore massively dominates. Critical minerals are a really small subset of the metals that we're actually extracting. They will have increased since 2019, but it's still quite stark. And the other thing I want you to bear in mind is there's all of the industrial minerals that we have to extract to kind of support this as well. So that's things such as concrete, limestone, all of those. So the impacts from those are much amplified than if we just think about metal mining that's needed to support the energy transition. So just for the last couple of minutes then, to touch on geopolitics. So how do some places get it right and others really don't? So up in northern Sweden, there's a big iron ore mine called Kiruna, which has been operating for, a long time now, over 100 years. And earlier, 6 months ago, they needed to move the church because the mine is still expanding, it's causing subsidence on top, and the church is a key local asset. And so they actually had full community support. I mean, this is what the internet's telling me. So people who are from that area might say differently, but there seemed to be really good support from the local people to actually move this church, enable the mine to keep pushing back, keep providing jobs, keep fueling the economy in this part of Sweden. And it seems to be a real success story for how to engage the local community. In contrast, we've seen huge protests in Serbia over the last few years around a proposed lithium mine there. And it seems to have been very embroiled in the local politics, and there seems to be a lot of misinformation, and it seems to be a really, really polarising thing. And reading about it and talking to people, it's tearing families apart with their support for it or not. And there seems to be a lot of misinformation around water will be polluted, the environment's going to be massively changed, people not believing the company when they say it will be an underground mine and it's done all of these tests. So it comes back to that interesting point around, not education, but how do we, as We Planet's purpose is, how can we make sure that facts and things are told in a way that resonates with people and brings them along in that journey as well. And then just to kind of finish, I wanted to show this slide as well. So I said at the start that in Europe, over the last few decades, arguably we've been outsourcing a lot of the impacts of the raw materials that we use. We've been mining them elsewhere, we've been paying other people to process them, and we've generally been buying a lot of the kind of finished products actually. And there's a real correlation between where mining occurs and the conflicts that are associated with it. And it's this theory of ecologically unequal exchange. So in some of the higher income countries, we buy embodied labour, resources, and we export the impacts of those. And this really plays out in this map of where environmental conflicts have appeared over the last few years, according to the Global Atlas of Environmental Justice. So always one for us to keep in our mind that if we are using these raw materials, where are we getting them from? What is the impact of it? And at what cost, and at what cost to who? So I just wanted to finish on this concept of donor economics, which I'm sure is familiar to lots of you. But it's trying to say, look, there's a foundation of what we need to have a good life. We need access to water, shelter, food, housing, energy, etc. But actually, there's also a ceiling. If we take too much of that, we kind of go past this ceiling, and that has negative impacts on our environment and our planet and the people around us. So how can we do better? I haven't got time to go through these. There's a whole host of standards and frameworks and performance that people can expect. But if we want to be able to meet the needs of the present without compromising the needs of future generations to do the same, this concept of sustainability, I think we do need to have these open discussions around, well, what do these impacts look like? Where do they occur? And how can we balance those? So to end, it's this theory of resource stewardship. Once we've found these mineral deposits, once we've, a mine is only ever a temporary land use, even though it can last for decades. But what happens to that land afterwards? How can we rehabilitate it, make space for nature and biodiversity whilst we're operating, and importantly afterwards? But how can we also keep those metals and all of those valuable things that we've extracted in circulation for as long as possible through designing things for second life applications, for recycling, and really just kind of looking after stuff and making the most of it. So thank you very much for listening, and I will hand it over now.
Thank you so much, and you can certainly continue on that topic when we have our panel discussion. And I love the ending because it's a really good introduction for the next speaker, because like Lucy, you said, we're outsourcing a lot of our environmental impact. So when I started to plan this webinar, it was very important to me that we get a perspective from these countries where we're outsourcing these environmental impacts to. So I want to introduce our next speaker, Gaston Siroit. He brings 20 years of experience in the energy sector. He's currently director of the Methane Emissions Observatory for Latin America and the Caribbean, and technical advisor at the Latin American and Caribbean Energy Organization. In these roles, he leads projects focused on decarbonization, geothermal, sustainable mining, and new generation fuels. Prior to joining OLACDE, he served as a director of technology with the Secretariat of Energy of Argentina, and he works for the IDB in the Energy Division Director of Technology. Gaston is an industrial engineer, graduated from the Buenos Aires Institute of Technology, and a mechanical engineer from the National Institute of Applied Sciences in Toulouse. So please welcome Gaston, and you can go ahead with your presentation.
Thank you very much, Tia. It's a real pleasure to be here. So thanks to We Planet for the organization. Thanks for the audience. It's a quite relevant topic, and nowadays with the huge amount of conflicts that we are having all over the globe, I think it's a topic that we need to reinforce because of energy security, because of geopolitical risk. So it's quite an interesting moment to bring this topic on top of the agenda. So to continue with Lucy's presentation, I think that she just present a quite clear framework about the mining within the energy transition. So I'm not going to go any deeper. We all agree that the world is moving into cleaner technology. And for Latin American and the Caribbean, this is not an exception. So the same way the world is moving forward, LAC region is moving forward. And depending on where you are, the energy transition in Europe or in Africa, in Asia, there are going to be different paths of the energy transition. We don't have exactly the same amount of facing this situation. However, is there any common part about it? Yes. Regardless the energy transition path that you will take, all of them require a huge amount of minerals. So you can say that you will go through an energy transition supported by wind and solar, or that you will move into sustainable mobility, or you will develop biofuels or any other technology regarding hydrogen or green hydrogen. What all these technologies or all these paths had in common, they will all require a huge amount of minerals. So just a few key points that will illustrate this statement. All the technologies will require, as we mentioned before, nickel, lithium, copper. So it's a fact. This is not something we can argue. These are facts regarding the concentration of each mineral in each technology. And if we take and we start adding and we make a projection over 2050, if we want to achieve this scenario where we keep the temperature 2 degrees below, the World Bank made a study and they arrived to 3 billion tons of minerals and metals. And again, I will take some of the information that Lucy pointed out. It doesn't mean that we will need 3 billions of lithium or copper. In here, we will add all the minerals we have. And again, it's not the same amount in absolute value that we'll need from iron that we will need from rare earth. However, the impact is going to be the same. Everyone will need from their own sector, from their own mining specialty, to increase this amount. Some of them, like for example, lithium, if we compare it to 2020, to the value of production of 2020, we will need 40 times more lithium. And if we ask, okay, how is that possible that would multiply lithium production 40 times. That's quite simple. That's because before, lithium was only used for medical purposes or for technology purposes, where the amount of lithium that was needed, it was quite slow, quite small. So now that we will need for storage or for electrical mobility, we will start needing more and more and more. The impact in terms of relative growth is going to be massive. So that's how we explain that for example, for copper, we need to double the production, and for lithium, we need to go 40 times the production that we had in 2020. It doesn't mean that we will need much more lithium than copper. No, just keep in mind some very easy figures. We are talking about 3 billion tons of minerals. Most of them are going to be iron. And then if we go below, the second biggest mineral that we are using is bauxite, the one that we use for the alumina. It's around 10% of the amount that you need for iron. So if we are talking about 3 billion, aluminum or bauxite, that is the mineral, will be like 300. And if we go to the next one, it's 10% of the value before. And which one is the third huge mineral you need? It's copper. So when we talk about 3 billion, 300 millions, then we are talking about roughly 30 million. And this scale is reproduced again and again. So the next mineral is 3 millions, and then you will need 300 until you reach one of the latest or the smallest rare minerals, the rare earth. And we are talking about a couple of tons. We don't even talk about 1,000 tons that you need per year. You need a couple of tons. And why are we all, the different organizations, speaking a lot about it? Because the concentration we have and the production that we have nowadays is very small. So for the industry of rare earth, the increase that they need to do is massive. Even if we are producing, for example, 25 million tons of copper and we are asking only to double, it means that you need another, like they said before, another production like we've done in the whole history of copper. We need to duplicate. It means that you need 30 million tons. For rare earth, you only need a couple of tons. This is just to give you an idea of when you listen to the figures. Just remember that you will have relative figures according to the own mineral itself, or absolute numbers, absolute figures, where iron, alumina, copper will be the massive production. So again, just for the lithium, some figures that we already present. So what's the interest for OLACDE? OLACDE is an international multilateral organization. So in Latin America, we have 27 countries from Mexico to Chile, where mining activity is in the heart of our activities. Remember that Latin America and the Caribbean produce roughly 25% of critical minerals worldwide. So we are talking about one fourth of the whole production comes from Latin America and the Caribbean. It means it's roughly, in terms of value, 150 billion dollars in terms of the productions of these minerals. And why is OLACDE supporting Latin American and Caribbean countries? Because we believe that it's possible to coordinate regional policy and strategy that allow our region to diversify its own role. So what's the role today? We are, like I think Lucy mentioned it before, we are producing the raw material and then we are exporting it. And where does it lead at the end? On one single player concentrating more than half of the refining of those materials. I think that we all know which country is doing this. So why we need to do it, and why we have a huge opportunity, because most of the countries are supporting Latin America and the Caribbean to push this diverse, to enhance the capability and the production capability for refining it on the ground. So it's a very important concept, and this is where we are supporting. We need to find a way of doing this. And since when we're doing this work? Olagde is 54 years old, so it was founded in the 70s. It was only 4 years ago where ministers of energy decided to put this topic on the table. So before, we didn't have, as an energy organization, this on the radar. We didn't consider as important as it was. And now we are realizing how important, like we said, for energy transition, minerals are. And the region realized it. So they have mandate Olagde to start working on this topic, but only 4 years ago. So what's the main objective? We need to find a way that help us in Latin America and the Caribbean to turn natural resources into development. So this is the key question at the very, very end. We will talk about the social conflict, and it's not a topic that we need to avoid. We need to talk about the social conflict, the environmental impact, but we need to find a way of turning this critical situation into an opportunity. Because like they present the example of the church, there are a lot of examples where the local communities are the one supporting the project because they believe in the technology. They believe they can save, they can do a good step into the climate change, and they believe they can have quality jobs and an opportunity for their children not moving away from their own land, and they can have a job and they can develop an industry. So sometimes there's a lack of understanding on the impact of mining for the local communities, where they don't see a risk, they see an opportunity. And I'm going to explain in a couple of slides why and how we turn from a critical or a difficulty or a challenge into an opportunity. Some figures, I'm not going to stop here, but to have an idea of what we said regarding the 3,000 for iron, the 368 for bauxite, and copper, lithium, etc. It's important to have these figures in mind, but I'm not going to stop on it. In here in green, you will see where our countries in Latin America and the Caribbean are in the top 3 of the producers. So you will see Chile, you will see Peru, you will see Mexico in several minerals where they are leading globally the production. Brazil as well. We had a graphic, a picture before worldwide where we have the production. Here, what we've done is making it for each single mineral. So at the end, if you put all these maps together, we will end up on the same graphic that was shown before. Some countries are depending on the production of their own minerals, and they are exporting a huge amount of these quantities. China, Australia, Brazil, the US, Canada, Russia. If you go and you see many of those minerals, you will see the same countries. And in a lot of scenarios, Latin America and the Caribbean are present. Another topic that I think that it's very important, we have a different definition for example, what in our region we consider a strategic mineral. What do we consider in Latin America and the Caribbean a strategic mineral? We consider a mineral that for the country that are producer, not consumers, it a strategic mineral because it can generate currencies, because it's going to be a vector for growth of the GDP. It will create jobs It will be an investor generator. It will help us on geopolitical negotiations. So again, where some countries will see a critical mineral from our side, we will see an opportunity. So we don't have to miss this opportunity. Why? Because all the reasons that I just point out. We have an opportunity. The train is passing. We need to jump into the train of development, and we have to use this strength that we have from natural resources and turn it into development without jeopardizing the impact on the environment and people. So I'm not going to go through all the challenge for all the aspect. I'm just going to stop here and to give the room to Gregory then, and then I will jump into the impact in terms of social sustainability and environmental challenges, if you're okay, Thea.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, Gaston. And so social license is a very important topic in mining. As well, one of the reasons I wanted to have this webinar was also because the discussion in Finland has been escalating because of the Critical Raw Minerals Act, and there's a lot of opposition to mining here in eastern Finland, where I live as well. But I mean, there needs to be a way to solve these if we want more mining to happen in the EU. So that's why I'm happy we have Gregory here, and he's also promised me that he's gonna talk about uranium as well, because as we Planeteers, we also believe that nuclear energy is a part of discussion, and we need to consider uranium mining as well. So Gregory Polcher is an associate senior lecturer at Luleå University of Technology. For the past 10 years, Polcher has focused his research on the relationship between mining companies and communities. He has been involved in case studies across Europe and Canada that investigate social license to operate, and has written on its conceptual development. In addition, his research looks at legitimacy, particularly in the procedural and value factors that affect trust. This work includes comparative analysis at the international, national, and local levels, looking at the relationship between government, industry, and society. So go ahead, Gregory.
Thank you so much, Teo, for the introduction, and thank you, Lucy and Gaston, for your wonderful presentations, and thanks to WePlant for inviting me here. Happy to be here and share some of my insights from my research. So what I titled my presentation today was Social License, Values and Attitudes, and the New Imperative for Minerals. So the key question, and I mean, clearly from Lucy and Gaston's presentations, is it's not really, it's not so much a question of whether or not we should mine, it's more a question of how we should mine. And I'm taking this presentation from that perspective in terms of what we should do when we're gonna mine. When we have this new imperative to mine, it's clear that if we want to actually realize this transition to electrification of so many of our industries, transportation, etc., we are sort of locked into a position where now we have no choice but to mine. So the question for me is, how should we do it? So we'll start with a broad definition of social license. So most people have heard of this term, social license to operate. But what does it mean? And I guess, what does it mean? Has it meant for me in terms of my research? So most people think about social license in terms of the focus on the outcome of corporate engagement activities. So this is the process. Mining companies have been pressured into, for a bunch of different reasons, be better social actors, to actually engage more with the communities in which they operate and talk to communities, understand what their needs are, understand how they can actually build a relationship. The other side of this is actually assessing the relationship between companies and communities. Do they have trust? Is there acceptance of mining activities? Is there a lack of acceptance? Are people protesting? So I think it's good. One thing that Ian Thompson, one of the sort of early writers of the social license to operate concept, has talked about is social license to operate should be thought of as both a process and an outcome. And I think that's a nice way to think about this relational aspect. You have to look at what's actually happening between these, between actors and what's the outcome of these activities. Then from a research perspective, but the question is, what are we actually assessing? And what should we measure? So in terms of activities, how can we assess what's going on? What type of mechanisms are companies using to actually engage with communities? And then how should we measure whether or not the relationship has trust or there's acceptance? So there's numerous concepts and terms linked to the idea of social license to operate. So in general, it's usually about acceptance. I mean, put simply, it's whether or not people accept mining in general or a specific mine operation. You can look at it from the concept of trust. Do people trust the mining industry as a whole? Do they trust the outcomes that come with mining? And do local communities actually trust the companies that they're interacting with? Then there's a broader question of legitimacy. Is it legitimate in the way that the industry has positioned itself? Do people accept the norms, the rules of how mining is governed? And a simple way to think about this is the more an industry and the way it's regulated, so this you could say the values of that industry align with the values of society, that industry will have greater legitimacy. And I think that's a very easy heuristic to measure whether or not an industry has legitimacy. And of course, this is going to vary greatly across the world because there's very different expectations about what mining should be, how it should be done, what the impacts are, what its usefulness is, depending on which country you're looking at, depending on which region or which community. Another thing that a lot of scholars have looked at is refocusing this notion of a social contract. So again, as a political scientist, we like to talk about the social contract. What is a social contract between your government and the population or the citizens within that country? So what do you expect your government to do in return for, say, taxes? How should they redistribute that wealth that they get from citizens? You can almost think of social license to operate as a similar social contract between mining companies and the public. Now, what's changing is sort of in inception, social license to operate was focused much more at the local level. So then the social contract was between a mining company and the community that's affected by its operations or in proximity to its operations. How that's changed now is this more societal view of the social contract between mining operations, the mining industry as a whole, and the outcomes for society. So now it's a question of what kind of burdens or harms is society willing to accept in order for the benefits of mining. So in terms of the role of value, so go back to the question the question I posed about what do we measure and what should we measure, and the congruence between values in the industry and values within society. You can think about values at two levels. One is core values of individuals. Are people more altruistic? Are they more egotistical? Are they willing to sacrifice or to self-sacrifice for the benefit of others? Or are they more individualistic? These are core values, and often these can be seen as sort of proxies can be seen in the ideas of conservation and then growth and development. And there's some linkages there. And while it's interesting and also important to look at these core values, it's also important to look at contextual values. How do these core values fit into questions that have a particular time and place? So when you ask someone, are you altruistic? Are you willing to sacrifice, your own well-being for others? It's important also to ask that question within a particular context. So is it sacrificing yourself for your local community, for your family, for society as a whole, for the globe? And then you get different answers based off of the level of context that you're adding to these questions. So whether or not people are willing to sort of accept some harms at the local level for their neighbors would be a very different answer of whether or not they're willing to make that same sacrifice for people around the world that they've never met. As a scientist, this makes this question very difficult in terms of what are values and how do we measure values. But one way we do that is by measuring attitudes. And we can measure attitudes within a context. And that gives us insight into what the values of these individuals might be. So what factors affect attitudes towards mining? So I'll talk very quickly or give a bit of an overview of one of the studies that me and some colleagues had done in two northern mining regions. One being northern Saskatchewan in Canada, where they have a primarily uranium mining, and the other in Norrbotten, Sweden, actually where Kiruna is, which Lucy talked about earlier. And we did a survey of the populations there. So in Sweden, this is primarily iron mining, and in Canada, it's uranium mining. The two regions have a lot of similarities. They're very sparsely populated, especially relative to the southern parts of these countries. They both have indigenous populations, and they also have rural population decline. So what did we find when we looked at these two different but comparable cases? To no surprise, corporate principles and ethics were fundamental to the relationship with communities. And this is not to say that there's one way to do it, but at least all companies operating in these two regions had some sort of corporate principles that were linked to engagement and working with communities. So because they had these corporate ethics, then establishing trust with communities was much easier. And to no surprise of anyone, trust in the company is a very strong predictor of acceptance. And that was the case in the two surveys that we distributed in these two regions. So I'll talk a little bit about the approach, the corporate approach in Saskatchewan. So the mining company is called Cameco, the uranium mining company. And so what they focused on was the proactive development of a local engagement strategy. So what they did is, what they wanted to do is before problems arose, they already had dialogue going on and a very regularized and open line of communication with the communities in proximity. Maybe even more importantly, the people working within the company were actually indigenous leaders from the community. So they had actually recruited people from the community to work within the company to actually work on developing this engagement strategy. So this was absolutely fundamental to this strong company community relationship and building trust. And more importantly, this had much more impact than any legal consultation requirements. So in Canada, of course, we have what's called the duty to consult. So the government, by law, is required to consult with Indigenous communities. What the company said was, of course, we'll meet the requirements of the law, but we'll actually be more proactive when it comes to this engagement. We won't just do the bare minimum when it comes to building relationships with our communities. We'll actually invest a lot more resources and time into building trust. So the company's engagement strategies ensure long-term ongoing community participation in environmental and social monitoring programs and business partnerships. And I think this is key. It's not just about actually having dialogue and talking about what the problems are and how to solve them. It's actually building institutions within these relationships. So a couple of things that they did is actually have these environmental and social monitoring programs. So they would have representatives from both the mining company and the community sit within a sort of board that would do environmental monitoring or social monitoring and look at the outcomes on a quarterly basis and say, what's happening? How's the environmental monitoring going? So not only is it joint monitoring, but it's also joint participation. You actually have members of communities sitting on environmental monitoring boards active in environmental monitoring. And the other is business partnerships. And this one is a bit more self-evident. When you look at, surveys have been done across the world around why people accept mining, it's the economic business end of the relationship. If there's no economic outcomes or no positive economic outcomes for communities, the likelihood they're going to accept mining operations is extremely low. Here again, it's a bit more of a sophisticated approach where they actually build long-term business partnerships. So it could be things around equipment management, equipment maintenance, catering. It could be clearing trees, building roads. So they actually have the contracts with local communities in terms of establishing long-term business partnerships in the operations of the mine. On the other side, so here are some of what I just talked about is the direct relationship between the company and the community. We also want to look at are there other indicators that can show when acceptance of mining increases. So we did the normal thing with a survey. We had a demographic variables, and they didn't say very much, actually. There's some weak findings that women and those who self-identify as Indigenous are less likely to accept mining than men and non-Indigenous individuals. Then we also want to look at from a value perspective. So we use the sustainability predictor variables, and those produce actually stronger models. So again, to no surprise, environmental conservation is a predictor of lack of acceptance for mining, and people who have values more akin to growth and business development, that predicted acceptance. The most interesting finding, I'd say, from the study was in trust with government. So we also asked individuals, do they have confidence in their national government? And do they have confidence in the subnational government? And national government had no significance. Whether or not people trusted their national government did not predict whether or not they accepted mining operations. However, confidence in the subnational government, in the case of Saskatchewan, it was the provincial government, provincial or municipal government, and in the case of Sweden, it was the regional or municipal government, was actually a relatively strong predictor of acceptance. And even so strong that when we regress these variables, confidence in subnational government changed the environmental conservation predictor to not be a predictor at all. It became neutral. So those who did not accept mining, who had strong environmental conservation values, if they had confidence in subnational government, it actually nullified this lack of acceptance. So it made them more neutral. And I think this is maybe one of the most important findings within the study is that if individuals trust their subnational government, who often are the ones who are dealing with on-the-ground issues around environmental management, economic management, social management, if people trust that level of government to actually do the right thing, then even those with environmental conservation concerns, those concerns at least are mitigated somewhat. So the role of government. So what was important, or what did the government do, at least in the Saskatchewan case, to actually alleviate some of the pressure on the company? One thing was this idea of mineral surface lease agreements between the company and government. So what those did is it forced the company to actually reach certain targets around employment and procurement. So what the government said is, we'll lease you the land. However, in using this land for a mining operation, you have to meet certain employment and procurement targets for the communities affected by mining operations. Why this was important is that then the company already had sort of a regulatory objective to meet, but they could decide however they want to meet it. And this is very key within social license to operate. Reaching goals is an important thing, but navigating the path to actually realizing these goals, companies need to have some flexibility and need to have different options to work with communities in order to reach these government targets. So the question for us in Europe and also for critical raw materials is, what does this mean and what takeaways can we get from this? So like I said earlier, and as you heard from Lucien and Gaston, geopolitics, regional and national security are driving this new imperative for minerals. So in Europe, almost on a daily basis, what you're hearing, and around the world for that matter, is critical minerals matter, minerals in general matter. Regions, countries are becoming much more protective of the minerals that are within their borders. Some countries wanting to expand their borders in order to gain minerals. So the imperative for minerals is actually forcing people to rethink what's social license to operate? How does it affect communities and how important is it for society? You heard already a little bit about the Critical Raw Materials Act, and that sets guidance and expectations within the EU on mineral extraction. And from a social science perspective, one of the most important factors within this is the reduced permitting times. So there's this 2+ years goal now for permitting time for extraction material of minerals. How do you achieve that? And this is one of the big questions that go back to the example in Saskatchewan. You can set targets. How then do you navigate these targets? Who's responsible for actually dealing with these new permitting time targets? Who are going to be the winners from new permitting times? Who are going to be the losers? How do you actually get can you get social acceptance of mining operations within reduced permitting times? And the big question, I think, for us and for around the world is how do communities fit into societal needs? It's clear that, as a global society, we're going to need minerals for the foreseeable future and an increase in minerals for the foreseeable future. How do communities fit into this? So one model that I developed with colleagues is this idea of the drivers of social license to operate and the loss of social license to operate. And we did this more from a European perspective because we want to know what are some of the preconditions towards getting support for mining operations and what leads to a lack of acceptance for mining operations. So you can see on the top side of the you could say diamond is this legal and procedural fairness. And this is something that we saw very consistently within Europe is that there has to be a perception of legal and procedural fairness before any sort of real support or collaboration can happen. So people want governments to actually have the proper legal and regulatory pieces in place before they can even start thinking about whether or not the company is doing proper engagement or benefit sharing with communities. On the flip side, on the lack of acceptance, again, lack of legitimacy for the project or industry. If an industry has a bad history within a country, the work gaining that legitimacy back is very difficult. What happens then further down the chain is then you lack confidence in a project or you have little confidence in a project. And then finally, back to this values question. If you have this fundamental clash of values, you're going to end up in places where you have protest. And like Lucy pointed out, this is what's happening in some countries across Europe. You have protests, people are not interested in mining. It doesn't matter and at that point, it doesn't matter what an individual company does. There's very little chance that they can do this by themselves. And so this brings this question of, okay, what's the role of the EU, of national governments, of the mining industry as a whole to change how people see the mining industry? And how do you overcome this clash of fundamental values? So the EU member states and communities, one of the things that needs to be improved is this idea of goal alignment. And I think there's a mismatch now, or at least a lack of communication around what the goals of the EU are, what the goals of member states are, and what are the goals of communities. And so when you see protests, especially at the local level, it's this differences in shared vision for the future. Communities have very different ambitions than bureaucrats working in the EU Commission. So how do you actually get better goal alignment between these different levels of government, different levels of society? I think that's one of the things that people need to think about. And a question is, how does the mining industry fit into that? Another issue is rethinking distribution of benefits within the European context. And so this is one of the findings I had from looking at a Canadian context versus a European or a Swedish context, is this the mechanisms for distribution of benefits. Because in the European context, there's, especially in Sweden, the strong welfare state, there's a belief that the state should take care of all benefits for citizens. And so the room to maneuver for companies is actually much more limited than it is in the Canadian context. However, as you can see in a lot of communities in northern Sweden, they're asking for a different model for benefit distribution. They want to be able to tax or have more royalties or taxes related to industrial development, and that includes mining. So I think there needs to be a rethinking. If you want to have this goal alignment and shared vision of the future, a rethinking about how distribution of benefits for industrial development happens at the local level. And then finally, it's this bigger question, should we have more devolution of power? Should municipal governments or regional governments actually have more power in decision making and also control over resources? If they're actually able to generate more revenue from resource development at a local level, would that actually change the equation of how people see mining operations within Europe? Rather than revenue going to the center or to the capital, they actually see this revenue staying where the extraction is happening. So I'll just end on this slide in terms of things that I've thought about in terms of Europe's future mining. So one is, and again, borrowing from the Canadian case, is this idea of EU national targets. And those are set. A lot of these in terms of how much emissions reduction, in terms of critical mineral extraction, recycling, production. There are national and EU targets out there. The question is who makes the decision on how this is done? And I would argue that there needs to be more local decision making in terms of how to reach these targets. The second thing is enhanced engagement methods. I think right now within the EU, it's very there aren't a lot of companies using very sophisticated engagement methods. And I guess I'll use Sweden as the example. They're starting to learn how to engage with communities, but because they haven't been doing it for as long as they have in, say, Canada or Australia, where they've had to work with indigenous communities for a long time, the way they think about engagement is still more around consultation rather than partnership building. And so I think in the EU, both legislators have to create space for companies to do this, and companies also have to take the initiative to come up with much more sophisticated engagement methods to work with communities. And then finally, like I said before, new benefit sharing and social environmental monitoring programs. People living in communities close to mines there needs to be more transparency and understanding, and most importantly, participation in what's going on. In order to build this trust between mining companies and communities, you need to have more local participation so that you understand what kind of outcomes for the environment are happening and what kind of influence can you have in decision makings around socioeconomic outcomes related to mining. And finally, benefit sharing, finding different mechanisms to actually keep benefits at the local level. So thank you.
Thank you so much. So we'll move on to the panel discussion. Reminding everyone that you can already put questions in the chat that we'll ask after the panel discussion. And so please do ask there were some questions about deep sea mining and other stuff. So feel free to ask anything, and I'm sure our experts say if they can't respond to some of them. And they'll do the best to answer all the questions that you have. We talked about the urgent need for critical minerals and uranium, but it's how we extract and manage and govern these resources that will define whether the green transition succeeds or stumbles. So I'm thinking about 3 questions that cut to the heart of this challenge. It's stewardship, regulation, and regional leadership. And so first, I would like to tackle the topic of resource stewardship. It was something that Lucy, you mentioned. So can you explain the concept of resource stewardship in more detail, and why do you think it's important for Europe?
Yeah, absolutely. So I suppose there's a couple of strands to it. So that first is, it's a lot of effort, and there are always going to be impacts associated with extracting raw materials, whether those are some environmental impacts or social impacts. Not to mention the fact that it can be quite difficult to find these mineral deposits in the first place. So once we have actually mined them, processed them, and got it into a usable format, the idea of stewardship is, well, how can we keep that in circulation for as long as possible? So an example that I had from a few years ago is there's a car called the Nissan Leaf, which is manufactured in the UK, and I think they've changed it now, and it's an electric car. And electric cars quite often have their battery cells arranged in pouches that are then stuck onto something using glue. And I remember chatting to somebody who was doing a recycling project in one of the universities here, and he said, look, the glue that they use to stick these pouches on to the, to form your battery pack, he was like, it is so hard to physically disassemble that battery that the time and effort it takes to do that means it's not economically viable to bother recovering the metals that are in it. And so just thinking about, well, how can we design these in a way that actually, once a battery has kind of come to the end of its usable life in an electric car, for example, could we actually put it into a bank with other batteries that don't charge quite well enough for you to use it in a car, but could still be really useful for some kind of microgrid storage? And then can we design it so that when it is at the end of its usable life, we can disassemble it easily and actually access those minerals? So it's thinking about design. But from a kind of asset perspective as well, it brings in, that concept that these are temporary land uses, but how can we make sure that we're actually maximising positive benefits and being stewards of that land as well? So rather than the kind of perhaps older school thinking of, here's a mineral deposit, we're going to dig it up, we're not necessarily going to engage with the local communities, and those benefits are going to be felt elsewhere because we're going to sell it elsewhere, we're going to make products elsewhere, that's where all the value add's going to happen. How can we flip that and start to think about, well, this is okay, a temporary land use, how can we try and enhance biodiversity perhaps whilst we're doing the extraction? How can we design things to minimise environmental and social negative impacts and maximise some of the positive ones? But then also, what happens in that transition post-mining? How do we support the economy if it's become reliant on mining? How can we catalyse in economic independence away from that mine whilst the mine's still operating, so that when it closes, it doesn't matter as much? And so it's that kind of, how can we think more holistically and think about biodiversity, people, benefits, as well as just how do we find these raw materials?
Thank you. Gregory, Gaston, do you want to add anything what Lucy said? I found it interesting when, Gregory, you said there was this concept of like shared governance, that there was a board that was monitoring these environmental impacts, and it was not just the mining company being in it, it was the locals as well. So I find that I've heard about that in another mining webinar as well. It was in Finnish. So I think that could be a really good solution for these concerns, because I know here in Eastern Finland, there's a lot, when it comes to uranium mining, there's a lot of people worried about can uranium get into the water? There's a lot of concerns like that. So Gregory, could you please tell us more about the shared governance and how they actually meet up and look at these environmental parameters?
Sure. I'm not an expert on the shared governance, but at least some of the insight that I got is uh, again, it's just institutionalizing cooperation between the community and the mining company. And so there's many ways to, I mean, there's a lot of different joint environmental monitoring boards out there and different structures of how they do it. But in essence, it can be a combination of representatives from a mining company, often local government. It could be a municipal or regional government, and then just members of the community who have expertise in environmental monitoring, obviously. And so also one of the benefits of that is that often it's the mining company who's paying for this. So they're actually paying for more competence within this community. So they, you can hire someone to be on this board or be trained to be on this board, and then serve as sort of the community representative to help with environmental monitoring. And why things like that are important is it's very simple things like, where do you put your water testing sites? Where are you doing your soil testing? And especially with indigenous communities, where certain places in the ecosystem are more cultural importance for any, but that's even though that's specific to indigenous, that's for any community. There are some lakes, say beaches, that are more important for the community than others. If a company doesn't know that, then the community can help them and actually facilitate, are we testing in the right places? And if you have that sort of mechanism in place, the ability to build trust between a company and a community is so much higher. Another example that I have, not, I mean, related to this is if you want to hire, say, a consultant to do water testing, if you're going to permit a new mine, one of the things that I've heard a couple Canadian mining companies do is they work with the local community in terms of picking out who the consultant is going to be. So rather than the mining company just hiring a consultant and people trusting, the outcomes from that report, they'll pay for the consultant, but the community gets to pick the consultant. So the community actually has a choice of who the consultant is because they'll trust that firm. And then the mining company pays for it. So again, when you hear it, it's so simple, it's so straightforward, it's so simple, but it's doing it. And I think it's just a tiny bit of creativity to create a lot more trust between a company and the community. And so these environmental monitoring boards or social monitoring boards, it's just more of an institutionalized way of doing this type of collaborative work related to a mining operation.
Speaking of regulation, you also mentioned in your presentations that there's now clear goals and guidelines from the EU. But who do you think is going to bear the brunt of meeting all of these? The industry or the member states or even the local communities?
From my perspective, I think the member states have to do a lot more I mean, the member states are the ones who are responsible for implementing. So, for example, with the CRMA, in terms of permitting, it's the member states, the national government that actually has to change, say, mineral legislation or the environmental code to actually conform with some of the recommendations of the CRMA, or maybe they're even stronger. It's not a directive, but it's essentially being regulated at the EU level around extraction. So this is putting a lot of pressure on national governments within the EU to actually rethink how they're regulating the mining industry. So a lot of pressure is on them because they will need to work with the EU, with the Commission. They'll have to work with mining industry, mining associations. They'll have to work with environmental conservation organizations. They'll have to work with mining companies and they'll have to work with communities. How can they facilitate, for example, consultations, like legally required consultations within a shorter time span? And how do you get all those actors together at the same? I mean, this is probably likely what's going to happen. The national government is going to have to find a way to facilitate sort of joint meetings between a bunch of actors. And who's going to also have to pay for it? Probably the national government. So I'd say the bulk of the pressure is on them to actually fulfill a lot of these requirements that come with the CRMA.
And building on that, and I think the point that you made earlier, Gregory, as well, if we're going to compress timelines for permitting so dramatically, bearing in mind it's 17 or 18 years on average around the world, and a huge amount of that is community consultation. But have we got the capacity and knowledge within the regulators at the moment to be able to do that and to assess things? And I'm just very nervous that there's a chance that in 5-10 years' time, there's mining projects that are now operating and perhaps corners have been cut or things haven't been fully scoped out, so that there may well be an environmental disaster or community relations really break down, and then that narrative of mining's really bad, just people are justified in saying that because it's like, well, you told us you could do all of these new things through technology and everything we've learned in other parts of the world, but actually if we've then not applied that here, it's a fine line to walk, isn't it? It comes back to, again, who pays for it? What's the cost of us doing all of these things in this compressed way?
Yeah, that was one of the concerns that popped up in my mind, is what happens if all these shortened timelines cause people to be against mining more than they are now. Like I think that's a legitimate concern, and that could happen. And so we need to find ways to mitigate that. Gaston, so you work for a regional body that's not representing one country, but multiple countries. How can regional bodies like LOCTIT drive transparency and sustainability in a resource development?
I think that for achieving this objective and following what we just discussed about time, that it was kind of paramount, as it has an impact that it goes and comes back and forward. because if you have a delay of 17 years, then what you have in your pipeline is going to be pushed forward. It means that the resources that you will need will not be there. So if we continue with this wheel, it will generate a shortcut in the production, which will generate a difference between offer and demand, which will put price moving up, like it happens with lithium a couple of years ago, which will generate a slowdown in the development of new technology, which will lead to a drop of the sales and which go back again to a drop of the price. And it's a circle that we already know that it happens. So at the very end, we have lost 2 or 3 years right on that and say, okay, instead of moving straight forward and not looking and stop and saying, okay, let's think about why we are taking so long. It's just a wheel spinning, and it's bringing us nowhere. So in terms of what we can do, and where we have the first lack of expertise that is needed, I think that the very first thing that we need to do is to put the communities at the very beginning of the projects. And why does it have an impact with transparency or with institutional support? Because if you start talking about what you want to do, and you invite the communities and you tell them exactly what you want to do, and I'm not putting a responsible into companies or into the local government or in the country government. I'm just putting it as it's everybody's responsibility to ensure that dialogue is fluent at the very beginning. It will generate trust. This trust will lead to transparency automatically, and this will reduce the time of getting your social license. Let's remember that we have two different type of license. You will have the environmental license, that it's a public document that is prepared by the company, but it's signed by the government. And then you have the social license. The social license is not something written. It's something that you gain with time and you can lose in one day. So it's two different paths. You need both of them. And in one case, you will need a lot of document, process, and technical information. In the other, you will need dialogue. You will need to build trust, and you will need to be transparent with the information. Then you will have within the government a lot of steps where we are supporting them, providing technology, providing new ways of processing the information. Because at the very end, when you move from social to environmental, if you take 2 years for the whole package of document to be approved, you're having the same impact at the end. So it's important to move forward with different, with the two type of licensing, and you need to ensure that your mining project is integrated into the society. You need to avoid migration. How many times it's happened that when you hear that you will have a project being developed in an area, you will have an internal migration. This internal migration, at least in Latin America and the Caribbean, can generate tensions, because maybe you will have towns of 500, 600 people and a workforce of 1,000. So you'll have more people coming to work than the inhabitants that were initially living there. So you need a huge presence of the government to avoid tensions to arise. You will have again, because of the cost of living, a huge increase, as companies will be paying maybe more than what they were used to have. So again, different things that you need to keep in mind for the social impact and the social license. And at last but not least, reinforcing safety in the workplace. We're still having in the 21st centuries death because of this activity. This should not be tolerated anymore. So if you manage to cover these 4 or 5 points, you put it in parallel within the environmental licensing, you ensure that from the very first day you have the community engaged. That's the type of support that you can provide from different organizations like COLACDE to the whole set of countries, so that you will provide tools they can apply, and then you will generate space for government to speak each other and to share experience. That will be, I think, the main tools that you can put in place to reduce the impact of the mining activity in environmental and social aspects.
Returning to or continuing about the local communities, Lucy, what do you think it would look like if a mining company would get it right? Like, what would it look like on a community level?
Well, to be honest, I think Gregory's probably given us a really good example of in northern Canada, and it's sometimes, having worked in the junior mining space, so junior miners are quite often the people who will go and find mineral deposits, and then more often than not it might be bought by a bigger company and developed by them. And junior mining companies are often a team of geologists who go out and like looking at rocks and haven't been trained in engaging with local communities. And so, but those first interactions that you have, as Gaston and Gregory have both said, can set the tone and what that relationship is going to be like over the next few decades. And, you know, as Gaston said much better than I can, social license to operate is something you don't get it and then you leave it in a box. You have to continuously maintain that dialogue, keep earning that trust, and keep earning that trust through transparency and sharing benefits and that shared value from those projects. So with everything in the mining industry, it is so context specific, and what good looks like in that context can't necessarily be then cookie cuttered and applied somewhere else. But there are some of those key foundations, you know, how are we treating people? What's our environmental impact? How are we sharing not just the monetary benefits from this project, but other things that we can do to improve the local environment where we are, whether that's access to infrastructure, education, upskilling people, economic independence away from the mines. How are we being transparent and inclusive in the governance from this? And I think that kind of shared board for environmental and social monitoring is a great example of it. But yeah, I think good is so context specific, but I think everything we've heard tonight, you just need to engage really early, engage authentically, and listen as well. Don't just come and tell people what you're doing and think that you've consulted and that's enough. Actually have the right people in place so that they can join in that conversation and allow people the ability to shape that project that you're doing as well.
It's interesting you bring up the point about like junior exploration companies, because I think that's actually one of the biggest challenges. It's a capacity thing. So whether it's capacity on the government side around, you know, permitting, things like that, or actual capacity in the industry side. So with exploration company, like you said, it's a bunch of geologists. It's, you know, sometimes like a mom and pop kind of operation. They don't have the expertise or know-how how to do sort of, you know, real full-scale, you know, corporate engagement with communities. But an example I have of, again, where can government do something here? And so one example is, again, I am Canadian, so I use all these Canadian examples, but the Ministry of, I think, Natural Resources in one Canadian province, what they did is they knew there was a deposit that was getting a lot of attention. So I think there was something like 10 to 15 exploration companies actually working around this lake. And so again, all these, you know, people see all this activity going on. They don't know what's happening. And of course, these small companies don't know how to engage and also just don't have the resources to do it. what the government did is said we're going to have like a town hall sort of meet and greet. So what they did is they booked a local, hall within the town. All of these different exploration companies got to set up like a little booth, and then members of the community got to attend. Were invited. There's probably, I forget, something like 50, 70 people there, and went to each booth and talked to all of these different junior exploration companies and asked them, okay, what kind of technology are you using? Where are you actually on the lake? What do you hope to find? And actually, just more important, people forget, just meeting someone face to face and talking to them and shaking their hand does so much in terms of building trust and understanding what they're doing. How intrusive are their operations? Not at all. I mean, if people knew how limited the impact of exploration was, they probably wouldn't wonder. But if you see equipment moving in and out and you don't know what's being used for, then of course, then skepticism grows, then then whispers start occurring within the community. And I mean, that town hall, there was also a Q&A session where members from the town hall got to ask questions of the government in terms of the government's intention, and then also these junior exploration companies. And that alleviated a lot of the anxiety around what was going on in exploration. But most importantly, it gave these junior exploration companies a platform that they couldn't create by themselves.
I have a question for all of you. I mean, the EU goals are very ambitious. Do you think we can make it? Like, just like considering that we have to somehow make it happen in the actual communities and member states, and it's not something that EU can dictate. Do you think these goals are anywhere near realistic? Can we achieve it? And from Gaston, I would like to hear how the discussion is in Latin American countries. Like, do you discuss about exported environmental impact, for example? Is there like ethical discussions about like, should we, actually provide all these minerals to other countries, or should we get more benefits to ourselves? So I would like to hear about the discussion, local discussion there. So Lucy, maybe you can start, and then Gregory, and then Gaston.
Oh, it's a difficult one, isn't it? I think it's very ambitious, and it's always good to have ambitions. I think there's a very long way to go in quite a short amount of time. And I think the intentions behind it are probably good, but I'm concerned that if we go too fast to try and meet these targets, that there are, that's going to cause us challenges further down the line. So I am going to be slightly pessimistic today and say perhaps it's a bit too ambitious, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't try.
Yeah, I agree. In terms of what the ambitions are, again, there's the thinking just about permitting times, the ambition to have this 2+ years. It's not going to happen. It just isn't. And so even in a best case scenario, it's going to take 5 to 10 years to get a lot of the mines that they want open. And that's like best case scenario in my view. So in terms of reaching all these goals, I don't think so. And so that's where I actually think more focus has to be put on managing supply chains of critical raw materials better. That's what the EU probably needs to put a bit more focus on, is actually building partnerships around the world. And hopefully this segues nicely into Gaston's comments, but building these supply chains with trusted partners and looking at sustainability more from a supply chain perspective than this more sort of domestic, if you want to call the EU domestic supply. We just can't reach that level of mineral extraction that they want to. I mean, I saw some comments or questions about recycling and things like that. Yeah, that technology is moving forward, but still not at the rate that it needs to if they actually want to reach a lot of these levels. So there's no choice but to extract more minerals. And I think because the EU is also just limited in terms of what mineral, what the deposit looks like, what the ore bodies look like within the continent, I think actually the EU is going to realize very quickly that supply chain and managing secure, safe, reliable partners in the supply chain is actually more important.
Some reflection on that. I think that sometimes the discussion it's about mining yes or mining no. I think that in many countries we are reshaping this question, and the question at the end is mining how. So the question about yes or no, it's an old question. So now the question is mining how? And to manage to get to this mining how, several countries in Argentina, in Colombia, in Peru, initiatives that were launched were to put together in working groups people that represent sectors that are against mining. So you don't leave people that are against mining away the discussion. These are the ones that you have to bring into the discussion first of all. So you need to identify who is against mining and you bring it into discussion. And if you manage to sit them around the table, you have already done 50% of your job. So once you have the people that are really protesting against mining, you have made 50% of the job. Why? Because the next question you will ask them is, okay, what are you against exactly? And once you start getting this answer, you can work on to find in any way at least one point where several actors, several stakeholders that are antagonists have one point in common. And once you have one point in common, you move forward for getting the second point in common. So maybe you will not start by having your mercury used for for gold and silver extraction. You will not get there at the very beginning. It's unrealistic. But we have a lot of region in a lot of countries and a lot of province in Latin America and the Caribbean where the sector has a cross on it. And like they said, metal mining is just a part of it. You have the whole rest of the mining activity. So once they said, I'm against mining, you say, okay, what type of mining are you against? Why are you against? Because you are providing some type of chemical that, okay, what about if I not using it? What about for the rest of the mining activity? Are you against sand mining to build homes and to progress in the local development, knowing that you will not have an export market for a lot or for mainly 80% of the mining? It's done locally for all the resources for construction. So when you start digging and separating and putting the people around the table, you've done half of the work. So I share with Gregory and Lucy that sometimes we have goals very ambitious in terms of productions or in terms of recycling. But I think that sometimes we need to change the focus because you will get the natural equilibrium in terms of the production that you will need according to your demand. Sometimes we have underestimated the demand, have overestimated the production. We will reach the normal equilibrium as we always done with all the products. So it's not going to be any difference on it. However, if you manage to start solving the difficulties in terms of the frictions around the sector, you will have already done huge steps, and you will be able to grow faster and to reduce the time for licensing and permitting in a dramatic way.
Thank you. So let's move on to the Q&A session. We have some questions in the chat. I'm probably not going to ask all of them. So there's a question that is China such a big player in mining because it doesn't really care about the environmental or social impact? Or is it just because they happen to have these minerals, for example?
I think there's probably lots of different strands to this answer, and I might not be the best person, but I can give it a go. So I think, arguably China can take a much longer term view than other countries. And in the early 2000s, they had incredible foresight that the energy transition was coming, that these elements were going to be key, and actually established these supply chains. And, rare earth elements, a vast amount of the world's resources of rare earth elements do occur within China. But actually what we found out subsequently is that rare earth elements aren't that rare. It's processing them that's really hard. But, in that time, China have developed a vast amount of the capability to process these raw materials. And in, places like South America or Australia, where there's big resources of lithium and other energy transition minerals, actually Chinese companies will have quite large stakes in ownership of these projects. So I think we can say fair play, incredible foresight, and it's only really in the last few years that it seems the rest of the world started to wake up and think, oh, hold on a minute, how do we access these things? Somebody has a monopoly on it. Perhaps there's an argument that maybe 10, 20 years ago, environmental and social impacts were perhaps, there's a different threshold for what was accepted or what happened, which would perhaps not have been acceptable in Europe or other parts of the world. It sounds like that is changing now, but I've not worked within China, so I can't speak to that. But that is definitely one of the sides of the argument. I think they've just had such a solid strategy on what they want their economy to look like and have actually implemented it, and everybody else has now woken up to it.
Gregory, Gaston, do you have anything to add?
No, not from my. I think that's not is sort of they first ones in, and they built
Yeah.
up those supply chains domestically. So now they're in the driver's seat. That's really that's the bottom line here.
So there was a question about deep sea mining. Is there anything on the European UK level that can be done to kind of prevent this from really starting to happen? Because there's a lot of concerns about the disturbing the ecosystems down there where we don't maybe have enough information of the issues it might cause. How do you feel about deep sea mining? Is that gonna just happen and become very big because we need these minerals? Is there anything we can do about it? And if we can, what should be done about it?
Personally, I think we don't know nearly enough about the ecosystems in the deep sea and the impacts that extracting materials from the deep sea would have. I know there are some companies who make claims that they can be very selective about just pulling these nodules off the sea floor, but again, I haven't seen any evidence or enough evidence that would give me confidence that we're not disrupting ecosystems that in a way that would be acceptable. I think as Europe, we can't ban all deep sea mining worldwide, but perhaps we can use some tools so we can refuse licenses in our exclusive economic zones, for example. Perhaps we can put a ban on purchasing minerals that have been obtained in this way. Also members of the International Seabed Authority, for example. So perhaps we can apply pressure in that way. It's very difficult. There are some countries, jurisdictions and companies who are very keen on this, so I don't think we can ban it. But even if we can't ban it, how can we be proactive and make sure that we're trying to shape that legislation to make it as best as we possibly can? And I think, how can we make sure that we are doing that environmental monitoring to actually find out what the impacts are to give us that informed view going forwards.
Gregory, I'm also curious to hear how social license would work in a deep sea mining scenario.
Yeah, that's a very good question. So I think, again, I'm definitely not an expert on deep sea mining, hardly an expert on mining, but definitely not deep sea mining. But I will say, okay, there appears to be a rush in Europe to actually, explore what's the potential for deep sea mining. And I think Norway is actually one of the leaders in terms of actually moving forward with deep sea mining. One is it helps to have a lot of capital they can spend on testing whether or not this is actually going to work. So more my comment is around, I think Norway is going to be an interesting test to see. I mean, it's a country that has pretty strong environmental regulations, but they also have a lot of capital and they have a lot of experience with offshore extraction activities. So because they have that expertise, I think they see themselves as well positioned to actually try this out. Because it's a new activity, how it's regulated is going to be new. What are the rules around that? And how do we then, like Lucy said, if there's sort of dirty deep sea mining, I'm not sure there's going to be such thing as clean deep sea mining, but say there's dirtier deep sea mining, how then will there be some sort of way to recognize where those minerals come from, that they come from operations that are actually having terrible effects for the underwater ecosystem. In terms of social license to operate, I think this relates more to, so I would say it's similar to, but not the same as offshore wind. I mean, there's a lot of people who protest offshore wind because again, it changes the landscape. Deep sea mining probably obviously won't have the same change to the landscape that offshore wind will, but it's still an industrial activity and people will know it's there. So I think people working, especially, industries on the coast, I think they'll have actually the biggest say when it comes to social license to operate. Would deep sea mining actually affect things like fishery operations, tourist operations on the coast? I think if there's going to be contestation around social license, it's going to be with those industries.
Gaston, is there any discussion about deep sea mining in Latin American countries?
Honestly, I'm not pretty sure. We have a lot of potential for land mining. If we take, for example, Bolivia, Chile, Argentina, you have more than 60% of the reserves in terms of lithium. We have more than 50% in terms of copper, just with the resources that you have already explored. So I haven't go any deeper on that deep mining. So my bad, I don't
No worries.
have any any other information about it.
No worries. There was a question about uranium sea extraction, like extraction of uranium from seawater, and I've seen a few papers about this. And there was a question that some of these papers state that it might be competitive with regular uranium mining, but is that true? Gregory, do you happen to know?
Sorry, I know nothing about uranium extraction from water. Sorry. I
Yeah,
don't even want
I
to
thought that
speculate
might be
there.
a very specific.
Yeah, sorry.
I suppose so. So when I was at Cornish Lithium, we were looking at extracting lithium from geothermal waters, and lithium is also present in seawater, but it's in such small concentrations, and similar for uranium. We can extract uranium from solution. Solution mining of uranium is obviously quite common, but I haven't seen some of the more recent papers, but I would be surprised if it's economically viable. I'm sure it's technically viable, but whether it's economically viable, I think might be a different question.
Thank you. I think it's time to wrap up. I want to thank all of the speakers. I think this was an excellent webinar. I learned so many new things. I'm really happy about this discussion, and I hope the audience had a good time as well. If you haven't joined our email list yet, you can do it by clicking that link, so you'll be informed about future events and webinars and our campaigns. And thank you again so much, and have a lovely rest of the evening, everyone.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.